Sometimes the most powerful move isn't saying more or doing more. It's disappearing calmly. When you erase your presence, you stop feeding an ego that relied on your attention. And in that quiet absence, what collapses isn't you. It's the illusion of control he once had. Ego doesn't thrive on love the way we often think it does. Love requires vulnerability, reciprocity, and the willingness to be seen fully. Ego, on the other hand, feeds on certainty that someone is there, available, and emotionally reachable. It grows strongest not when there is deep connection, but when access feels guaranteed. That's why someone can seem confident or indifferent while knowing you're still within reach, even if they're not investing emotionally in return. Access creates a sense of control. When a person knows they can text you and get a response, drift away and still be welcomed back, or keep you emotionally engaged without committing, their ego remains comfortable. They don't have to question their importance or confront the possibility of loss. Your presence becomes proof that they still matter, that they still have influence. That validation happens quietly and continuously, often without either of you consciously realizing it. This is why love and ego often get confused. You might think staying kind, available, or understanding will inspire deeper connection. But when someone is operating from ego, that availability doesn't deepen intimacy, it reinforces complacency. They begin to associate your presence with stability rather than value. You become part of the emotional furniture of their life, something dependable but no longer consciously appreciated. When you erase your presence, you remove the fuel source. Suddenly, there is no confirmation of access, no reassurance that you're still there, no emotional response to lean on. The ego, which relied on that constant signal of relevance, begins to destabilize, not because of cruelty or punishment, but because a structure built on access cannot survive once access is gone. This absence creates a psychological shift. Without you present, they can no longer measure their importance through your availability. They can't test whether they still have an effect. That uncertainty is uncomfortable for the ego because ego prefers predictability. It wants to know where it stands. When you disappear calmly, you introduce a question the ego hates. Do I still matter if they're gone? Importantly, this isn't about trying to hurt someone or trigger insecurity. It's about understanding the difference between being loved and being accessed. Love is chosen freely again and again. Access is taken for granted. When you remove yourself, you stop allowing the two to be confused. You reclaim the boundary that says your presence is not automatic. It is meaningful. This shift also changes how you see yourself. When you stop offering easy access, you're no longer performing emotional labor for someone who hasn't earned it. You begin to feel the relief of not being constantly available, not waiting for signals, not adjusting yourself to stay connected. That relief is a sign that you were giving more than you were receiving, even if it didn't look dramatic on the surface. If ego collapses, it happens in the quiet moments when they realize something essential is missing. Not just attention, but the steady confirmation of importance that your presence provided. And if it doesn't collapse, that too is revealing. It tells you the connection was built more on convenience than depth. Either way, erasing your presence restores truth. It exposes whether there was real connection or just comfortable access. And in doing so, it protects your energy, your self-respect, and your ability to offer love only where it is genuinely valued, not merely assumed. Confrontation feels powerful in the moment. Saying everything you've been holding in, demanding answers, expressing hurt, or pointing out inconsistencies can feel like reclaiming control. But for someone driven by ego, confrontation often has the opposite effect. It gives them something to push against. It confirms that they still have emotional impact, that they still matter enough to provoke a reaction. Even anger or disappointment can serve as validation when ego is involved. Ego thrives on engagement. It doesn't care whether the attention is positive or negative, only that it exists. Arguments, emotional messages, repeated explanations. All of these keep the connection alive in some form. They reassure the ego that it still has relevance, that it can still affect your emotional state. This is why confrontation rarely produces the outcome you hope for. Instead of inspiring accountability, it often reinforces the very dynamic you're trying to escape. Calm absence works differently. It offers no resistance, no emotion to wrestle with, no narrative to challenge. There is nothing to argue against when you quietly step away. No dramatic exit, no long explanation, just a clean withdrawal of presence. That lack of friction is unsettling to ego because it removes the feedback loop it depends on. There's no way to measure influence when there is no response. Silence creates a vacuum. In that vacuum, the ego can no longer externalize blame or distract itself with conflict. Without an argument to focus on, the attention turns inward. Questions begin to surface, not because they were forced, but because there's nothing else to occupy the space. The calmness of your absence sends a powerful message. You are no longer invested in managing their emotions or correcting their behavior. What makes calm absence so disruptive is its confidence. It suggests you are secure enough to walk away without needing to prove anything. You're not asking to be understood or validated, you're simply choosing peace. That choice undermines ego, because ego depends on the idea that it is central, that it must be engaged with. When you stop engaging, you remove yourself from that story entirely. Calm absence also denies the ego its favorite role, control. In confrontation, the ego can twist the narrative, minimize feelings, or reframe the issue to maintain superiority. In silence, there is no narrative to control. The story becomes simple and final. You are gone. That finality is difficult for ego to process because it cannot negotiate with quiet. At the same time, calm absence protects you. Confrontation often leads to emotional exhaustion, regret over things said, and lingering attachment. Silence allows your nervous system to settle. You're no longer reliving the same cycle of reaction and disappointment. You create space for your emotions to stabilize and for clarity to emerge. It's important to understand that calm absence is not passive or weak. It is intentional. It is a boundary enacted through action rather than words. It says, I know my worth well enough to step away without drama. That self-assurance is deeply unsettling to ego, which prefers either compliance or conflict. If ego collapses, it happens not because it was attacked, but because it was deprived of fuel. And if it doesn't collapse, you still win. You've removed yourself from a dynamic that required constant emotional effort. You've chosen dignity over reaction, peace over performance. In the end, calm absence is powerful precisely because it is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't seek acknowledgement. It simply withdraws, and in doing so, it leaves ego with nothing to hold on to, while you move forward grounded, centered, and free. Ego needs validation to stay alive. It needs confirmation that it matters, that it is seen, and that it still has influence over someone else's emotional world. Reactions, whether they come in the form of affection, frustration, explanations, or even silence that still waits, are all signals of relevance. When you react, you participate in a dynamic that quietly tells the other person, you still matter enough to affect me. And that message, even when unintended, feeds the ego. Reacting doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it's replying quickly. Sometimes it's checking in after being ignored. Sometimes it's explaining your feelings again in hopes of being understood. Even disappointment can become a form of validation if it's expressed repeatedly. Each reaction confirms engagement. It reassures the ego that it still has a place in your emotional landscape. When you stop reacting, something fundamental changes. There is no longer feedback, no emotional mirror, no evidence that your presence is still being monitored or negotiated. This absence of response creates uncertainty for ego because it removes the proof it relied on. Without reaction, ego has nothing to measure itself against. It cannot tell whether it still matters, and that ambiguity is deeply uncomfortable. Validation doesn't require praise. It only requires attention. Explaining yourself, defending your position, or asking for clarity all communicate that the relationship still holds emotional weight. By erasing your presence, you remove that weight. You stop offering emotional energy where it isn't reciprocated. That withdrawal isn't cold, it's conscious. It reflects a decision to protect your inner world rather than continue feeding a dynamic that drains you. This is also where personal power returns to you. When you stop reacting, you stop outsourcing your emotional state. You're no longer allowing someone else's behavior to dictate your mood, your confidence, or your sense of worth. You reclaim agency over how you feel and how you respond. That self-control is not only empowering for you, it destabilizes the ego that once depended on your reactions. For someone accustomed to emotional engagement, the sudden lack of reaction can feel like a loss of identity. Ego often defines itself through impact. When that impact disappears, it has to confront an uncomfortable truth. Attention was never guaranteed. Influence was never permanent. Your calm withdrawal exposes that reality without saying a word. Stopping reaction also clarifies truth. Without ongoing engagement, you're able to see the situation without emotional distortion. You're no longer caught in cycles of hope and disappointment. You observe behavior as it is, not as you wish it to be. That clarity strengthens your boundaries and reinforces your standards. It's important to recognize that this shift isn't about punishing or manipulating. It's about self-respect. You are not trying to provoke a response. You are choosing peace. The effect on ego is a byproduct, not the goal. Your focus is no longer on being seen or acknowledged, but on preserving your emotional well-being. If ego collapses, it happens quietly in the absence of validation. If it doesn't, that too is informative. It confirms that the connection depended more on reaction than on depth. In either case, your decision to stop reacting marks a turning point. You've stepped out of a cycle that required constant emotional labor and into a space of self-directed calm. Ultimately, when you stop reacting, you stop validating a dynamic that no longer serves you. You no longer give away your energy in small, habitual ways. You choose stillness over explanation, clarity over chaos, and in that stillness, your power becomes unshakable. What makes your presence powerful isn't just that you were there, but the specific energy you brought into his life. Your way of listening, your emotional intelligence, your warmth, your patience, your ability to understand him without him having to explain everything. These things are not generic. They are not easily replaced. While someone may assume they can move on quickly or fill the space with someone else, they often underestimate how unique that emotional chemistry truly was. At first, replacement can feel convincing. New attention, novelty, or distraction can temporarily mask absence. Ego often leans into this phase, believing that what was lost can be replicated elsewhere, but novelty fades. Surface-level connection eventually exposes itself for what it is, and when that happens, comparison begins, not consciously at first, but emotionally. The depth you offered becomes noticeable precisely because it is missing. Your energy wasn't just about affection. It was about how you made him feel in moments of uncertainty, stress, or vulnerability. You may have been the one who brought calm when things felt chaotic, or understanding when he felt misunderstood. That emotional safety is rare, and it isn't something that can be manufactured quickly with someone new. When that safety is gone, it creates a gap that distractions can't fully close. This is when loss becomes real. Not the dramatic kind that demands immediate action, but the quiet realization that something meaningful is no longer accessible. He may notice it in moments when conversation feels shallow, when emotional support feels transactional, or when connection lacks depth. These moments highlight what can't be replaced, the emotional resonance you brought into his life. Importantly, this realization doesn't happen because you remind him of your value. It happens because your absence allows contrast to emerge naturally. When you're no longer present, there's no way to ignore the difference between connection that nourishes and connection that merely occupies time. That contrast is what exposes the truth. At the same time, your absence protects you from being reduced to an option. When you stay available, your energy risks being taken for granted. When you step away, you preserve the integrity of what you offered. You prevent it from being diluted or undervalued. That self-respect ensures that if your presence is ever reconsidered, it's done with clarity rather than convenience. If he tries to replace your energy and fails, that realization belongs to him. It's not something you need to witness or validate. And if he succeeds in distracting himself indefinitely, that too provides clarity for you. It confirms that the connection was not rooted in the depth you deserved. Either outcome frees you from uncertainty. The deeper truth is that your energy was never meant to compete. It was meant to be recognized. By erasing your presence, you remove the comparison entirely and allow truth to surface on its own. You stop proving, explaining, or offering pieces of yourself to be evaluated. When someone cannot replace your energy, it doesn't inflate your ego. It strengthens your self-respect. You understand that what you bring is meaningful and should only be shared where it is valued. Your absence becomes a mirror, reflecting what was lost without you having to say a word. In the end, the loss of your presence isn't about punishment or regret. It's about honesty. It reveals whether the connection was deep enough to be missed beyond novelty. And regardless of the outcome, you walk away knowing that what you offered was real, irreplaceable, and worthy of appreciation. Self-respect is not loud. It doesn't announce itself, threaten, or demand recognition. In fact, its power lies in how quietly it operates. When you choose yourself without drama, without ultimatums, and without trying to control the outcome, something fundamental shifts in the dynamic. You stop playing a role in someone else's emotional economy, and that alone changes everything. Power dynamics in relationships are rarely about who cares less. They are about who is more grounded in their sense of self. When you tolerate inconsistency, mixed signals, or emotional half-effort, the balance subtly tilts away from you. Not because you lack value, but because you are offering access without requiring alignment. The moment you step back with self-respect, that imbalance corrects itself. Choosing yourself quietly sends a clear signal. Your standards are internal, not reactive. You are no longer responding to behavior by negotiating, explaining, or adjusting yourself to be chosen. You are acting from a place of self-trust. That is deeply unsettling to ego because ego thrives on control and predictability. It wants to know how to get a reaction, how to pull you back in, how to remain central. Self-respect removes that predictability. When you walk away calmly, you also remove leverage. There is no emotional bargaining chip left, no access to your time, your reassurance, or your understanding. You are no longer available to be used as a source of validation or emotional stability. That loss of leverage forces a reevaluation of the dynamic, not because you demanded change, but because you stopped participating in imbalance. This shift also changes how you see yourself. You begin to feel aligned rather than conflicted. You're no longer acting against your own needs in order to preserve a connection. That internal alignment creates confidence that doesn't depend on external approval. You feel steadier, clearer, and less reactive. That steadiness is power in its purest form. Self-respect also creates emotional boundaries that protect your peace. Instead of being pulled into cycles of hope and disappointment, you create a clean emotional break. That break allows you to heal without interruption. You reclaim mental space that was once occupied by analysis, waiting, and emotional labor. In that space, your sense of self strengthens. Importantly, self-respect does not aim to punish or teach a lesson. It doesn't need the other person to feel anything specific. Its purpose is self-preservation. The effect it has on the other person is secondary. If their ego struggles with the loss of access or control, that struggle reflects their internal state, not your intention. This quiet self-respect often invites a different kind of attention, if any returns at all. Not the casual, inconsistent kind, but attention that comes with awareness and effort. And if no attention returns, the outcome is still empowering. You have not diminished yourself by staying where you were undervalued. Ultimately, self-respect rewrites the story without confrontation. It says, I know who I am, and I act accordingly. That clarity dissolves confusion and restores balance. Whether or not the other person understands it immediately is irrelevant. The power shift has already happened within you. By choosing yourself calmly and consistently, you step out of emotional chaos and into self-authority. You no longer wait to be treated well, you require it through your actions, and in doing so, you create a foundation of strength that no ego, no absence, and no outcome can take away. At the end of all of this, the most important transformation is not what happens to him, but what happens to you. It's easy to focus on the idea of his ego collapsing, his regret surfacing, or his realization finally arriving. But those outcomes are external and unpredictable. Your growth, on the other hand, is internal and entirely within your control. And that is where the real power lies. When you erase your presence, you step out of a cycle that was quietly draining you. You stop measuring your worth through someone else's attention, effort, or inconsistency. You stop waiting for signs, decoding behavior, or hoping for a shift that may never come. That release creates space for something far more important than validation, peace, and peace has a way of rebuilding you from the inside out. In that space, you reconnect with yourself. Your routines stabilize, your emotions settle, your sense of identity strengthens because it is no longer defined by how someone treats you. You begin to trust your own decisions again, rather than questioning whether you did too much or not enough. That self-trust becomes the foundation for everything that follows. If his ego collapses, it happens quietly, somewhere outside of your awareness. And if it doesn't, nothing is lost, because the purpose was never to provoke a reaction, it was to reclaim your emotional independence. You are no longer invested in how you are perceived by someone who couldn't meet you with consistency or depth. That detachment is not coldness, it's clarity. Rising also means redefining what you accept going forward. You carry the lesson with you, not as bitterness, but as wisdom. You become more discerning, more grounded, and more aligned with your values. You recognize early when a dynamic feels unbalanced, and you respond with boundaries rather than self-abandonment. That evolution changes the quality of every future relationship you enter. Your confidence also deepens, but not in a performative way. It's quiet, steady, and unshakable. You no longer feel the urge to prove your worth or compete for attention. You know what you bring, and you know it deserves to be met with presence and intention. That confidence attracts healthier connections, not because you're trying to attract, but because you are no longer available for anything less. There is also freedom in this rise, freedom from emotional loops, from overthinking, from waiting, freedom to direct your energy toward growth, creativity, and joy. You reclaim time and mental space that was once spent on uncertainty. That reclaimed energy becomes fuel for your own life. Ultimately, the sixth keynote is about remembering that your value does not rise or fall based on someone else's ego. You don't need collapse, regret, or acknowledgement to validate your decision. You rise because you chose yourself. You rise because you honored your boundaries. You rise because you stepped away from a dynamic that asked you to shrink. And that rise lasts. Long after emotions settle and stories fade, what remains is a stronger version of you, clear, grounded, and self-directed. Whether he ever looks back is irrelevant. You are already moving forward, carrying peace instead of questions, and strength instead of doubt. In the end, erasing your presence isn't about breaking his ego. It's about building your own peace and self-respect. When you step away calmly, you stop feeding what drained you and start honoring what you deserve. Whatever happens on his side no longer matters, because you've already risen into clarity, strength, and emotional freedom.